It's time to kick ass and chew bubble gum. And I'm all out of gum.
How's everyone doing? MrJohn here, and next up we have our first PS2 game to review, and that game is none other than Burnout, released for the PS1 in November 2001 and for the GameCube and Xbox in the following year. Published by Acclaim, who also published Turok, and developed by Criterion Games, who prior to Burnout, they made Airblade and Red Light Racer. I remember buying this game as a kid, and I have fond memories of it. Anyways, let's see if Criterion First Impact in the racing genre was actually pretty good. So without any further ado, let the crash party begin. When you boot up the game, you can select the following modes. Championship mode, which is the real meat and potatoes of the game. Single race, which is self-explanatory. Head-to-head mode, which is a two-player mode. Time attack, and special, where you can play special modes like face-off and survival. Then you could choose your car and your track and you're good to go. So what about the gameplay of Burnout? Is it good? Well, yeah. You see, the Burnout games have that break the drift style of gameplay, which in itself is pretty addictive, and what made the series as a whole pretty good, among other things. The game has a boost mechanic. In order to get boost, you have to drive the wrong side of the road, drifting around corners, doing near misses, and last but not least, doing perfect laps. However, you can only use the boost if you fill the bar to the max, and then you can boost. And if you drive dangerously while boosting, you could perform a boost chain, where the boost bar will refill, allowing the player to keep boosting. However, if you crash, which will happen in this game a lot, your boost bar will be depleted. When it comes to the controls, Burnout 1 feels a little bit stiff with the controls when it comes to controlling the car. The handling of some of these cars are, for a lack of a better word, clunky. Some cars handle fine, others not so much. It takes time to get used to it, and it could have been much worse. It's just the controls aren't as tight or responsive as the other entries in the franchise. However, I found out that the game controls much better by using the D-pad rather than the analog sticks. That's not to say that controlling the car with the analog sticks is bad per se, it's just that using the D-pad feels more responsive and using the analog sticks to control the car is a bit stiff. But that's my opinion, so take that statement with a pinch of salt if you will. The sense of speed in this game is actually pretty good. Especially when you boost around the corners, you feel that heartbeat sound effect and that motion blur effect. It feels like you're in a rush of adrenaline. The championship mode has a series of championships with 3 racers each, and the player must finish above a certain position before they are allowed to progress to the next race. Which isn't that hard to do on paper, but in execution the races themselves are pretty difficult, but I'll get to that later. As you progress to the championship mode, you unlock more content, like tracks, special modes like survival and free run, and new cars to choose from. However, in order to unlock new cars, you have to play the face-off mode, which consists you versus the car you want to unlock. If you win the event, you'll unlock the new car. It's just that simple. The championship mode's length is pretty short compared to the other entries in the franchise, if you know what you're doing. It can take at least 2 hours to complete, which for today's standards is pretty short. However, there's a reason why the mode is pretty short. It's because the game is pretty difficult compared to the other games like Burnout 2 and Revenge. Burnout 1 is pretty difficult due to traffic density as well as the rubber band AI. The traffic in this game is dense as heck compared to the other entries in the franchise. It is pretty chaotic to avoid the traffic. Not to mention that they can blindside the player either by appearing out of the corner suddenly, or there's even moments that a larger vehicle, for example a truck or a bus, can entirely block the player, which it can be infuriating at times, as one crash can clearly cost the race and your position as well. It's so dreadful when you're doing so good and then in the final lap, when you crash into a vehicle, you lose everything, forcing the player to restart the race. Now that's frustration on a whole nother level coming to my mind. And it's not just the traffic that makes the game difficult, it's the AI. The AI in this game has that infamous rubber band effect, where no matter how good you are in this game, the opponent will catch up to you no matter how well you drive. Not to mention that if you make one mistake, then the chances of reaching first place will be nigh impossible, as the opponent will go pretty fast if you get crashed and you have almost no chance to catch him up. However, the AI can be dumb sometimes as they crash on traffic, giving the player the chance to recover quickly, which is pretty nice. These things make Burnout 1 one of the hardest in the franchise. Now, the game can still be fun and exhilarating if you know what you're doing, but it can be frustrating at times. The game has 16 tracks, some of them being reversed, and there's tracks like USA Marathon that combines all the USA tracks in the game into one big track, and these tracks can take between 15 to 18 minutes to complete, which for some it can be tedious. The track design, while not as complex nor great as the other entries in the franchise, for the time the track design was good. Some of them are based on a location in USA and Europe, and there's some variety. For instance, there's a track that takes place in a mountain valley with tunnels, and there's another track that takes place in a busy city filled to the brim with traffic. The car roster in Burnout 1 for today's standards is pretty basic. Sure, at the time these cars were pretty realistic, but nowadays they look like meh, not as cool as the other cars in the sequels. Just like with the other games in the franchise, the cars from Burnout 1 are based on real life cars. For instance, the muscle car is based upon the Dodge Viper, whereas the Saloon GT is based upon the Subaru Impreza 22B, which is my favorite Impreza by the way. The cars sadly feel the same as each other, making the car roster pretty shallow for not having cars with different stats. Granted, you can ride a bus and a truck, which is pretty hilarious if you ask me, but they are pretty slow and unusable for any race event in the game. Overall, the car roster in this game compared to the other games in the franchise is pretty shallow, as it doesn't feature any racing tuned vehicles or upgraded models, and there's no variety between them. Disappointing, I know. One of the main charms of the Burnout franchise is the crashes, and Burnout 1 was the first game to feature the crashes. At the time they were pretty hilarious and pretty realistic. I like how the car got totally damaged when crashing into things. You can see the windows crack, the bumpers be deformed, you name it. If your objective was not to win the race, and instead wanted your car getting destroyed in many ways as it can, then the crashes were pretty fun to watch. Not to mention that you could watch the replays of your crashes, as well as saving these replays to watch it later, which is pretty cool. As I said before, you can also unlock special modes, such as the survival mode when you have to race around the track without crashing once. If you crash once, game over, and there is the free run mode where it's like the time attack mode but without the traffic. I personally think this mode makes the tracks look naked without the traffic, and I usually don't play this mode because of that. Overall, the gameplay of Burnout 1 is still fun, albeit with some flaws along the way, such as the unforgiving difficulty at times, as well as traffic density that can sometimes fuck the player, among other things such as the rubber band AI and the shallow car roster. However, the tracks are fine, and the controls, while stiff and not as tight as the other games, it's not bad either, as you need to take time to get used to it. Graphics wise, while pretty basic nowadays, at the time they were pretty good for a PS2 game. The game runs at 60 frames per second, which in that regard will always be an A+ in my book, not to mention that the game looks pretty colorful for the most part. Also, the lighting in this game was pretty good. For instance, in some tracks, you can see the wet roads reflect light, which is pretty damn cool to see. The car models look pretty dated for today's standards. Sure, they looked cool at the time when this game came out, but nowadays they look pretty dated. The soundtrack of Burnout was composed by Stefan Root, who also composed the soundtracks of Burnout 2 and Burnout 3 Takedown, and I gotta say that the soundtrack is pretty damn good. Here, listen. One thing that I like about the soundtrack is that when you race around the track, the soundtrack will change after a while, or when you crash many times. It changes from a moderate upbeat song to a suspenseful song, which makes the game pretty tense as it is, and I really like the idea of changing the soundtrack to accommodate the situation you are in. Great job, Criterion, great job. So, is Burnout 1 any good? Well, it suffers from a syndrome called first game syndrome, a syndrome that many first games of any franchise suffer, and Burnout 1 is no exception. The first game is not by any means bad. Is it still fun? Absolutely. However, it does have some flaws that made the first game not as good as the other entries in the franchise, such as the rubber band AI, the density of the traffic that can screw up the player, among other things such as the shallow car roster. If you want to start with the Burnout franchise, just start with Burnout 2. It's a much better game than its predecessor in every possible way. Overall, Burnout 1 isn't a bad game by any means, but if you play the other games, you'll find out that Burnout 1 has not aged well in some departments. Nevertheless, the game can still be fun to play, and had Burnout 1 not been successful, we wouldn't have the sequels that were much better. So overall, Burnout 1 is a decent game. It's janky, but it's still fun despite of its flaws.